Hello and welcome everyone to the Broadbent Institute's conversation with Paris Marx, author of a new book entitled Road to Nowhere, What Silicon Valley Gets Wrong About the Future of Transportation. My name is Clement Nocos, Director of Policy and Stakeholder Relations at the Broadbent Institute, and your host for today's conversation. And so, just quickly, as greenhouse gas emissions, ramp up, housing prices reach astronomical heights, and we all stay stuck in traffic. Road to Nowhere looks at how the quest for market share got us to this point, and why visions of the future from California tech billionaires simply can't solve these problems. And you can also read my review of this book on the Broadbent Institute blog at broadbentinstitute.ca. And a bit about our author, Paris Marx. They are a Canadian technology writer whose work has been published by NBC News, CBC, Jacobin, Tribune, Passage, Canadian Dimension, among others. And as Elon Musk's #1 nemesis, Paris was most recently published by Time magazine in a piece entitled "Elon Musk is convinced he's the future. We need to look beyond him," published just only months after the same magazine named Musk 2021's Person of the Year. So a little bit of notoriety to our guests today.
I'll just say on that point as well, not to interrupt you, but it's been really fascinating to me to see how popular that piece was, like how much it really blew up. And as of last night, it was still the most popular piece on Time Magazine's website, and it was published a week, last Monday. So it's been really huge. And I think it really shows the degree to which people are really kind of turning on Elon Musk and reassessing Elon Musk. And a little bit of exclusive for Broadbent Institute for our conversation. I did actually try to include a reference to the fact that Time named Elon Musk its Person of the Year in the piece. My editor was all for it, but the editors a bit above her were not having it, and so that got removed from the piece. But I think a lot of people made that association and recognized that this was quite a different perspective on Elon Musk being published by a publication that very recently ignored a lot of the criticisms that existed about him to name him its Person of the Year.
I think we'll get more into Musk later, but I think there is that appetite, that desire for someone to take Elon Musk down a notch. The same thing with all these billionaires out there, in their so-called climate solutions. I think the piece does a good job of, at least stirring some things, some resentment, or stirring some, shifts in thinking against all the PR machine behind folks like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. But to also, come back to what backs up sort of your thoughts and your research on this. You also hold a master's in urban geography from McGill University, and myself, also a fan of the critical technology podcast, Tech Won't Save Us, which I also highly recommend to gain a critical perspective on just really a whole range of issues like the future of work, technology, how it's supposed to help us fight climate change somehow, and everyone's favorite current, topic that we're riding the waves of is cryptocurrency. Lots of discussions on cryptocurrency, the financialization of technology. Loads of perspectives shared on Tech Won't Save Us, so highly recommend folks to check it out. And Paris, thank you for taking the time to chat with us. Also, if you are joining us on our Instagram Live, please feel free to comment and ask questions in the chat below. Okay, and so I think to get started, back to Road to Nowhere. To me, one of the central theses of the book is that, visions of the future for the rich and powerful, they're always kind of informed by impractical novelties in technology. So from the start of the book, you describe General Motors' Futurama exhibit, which is the inspiration behind an amazing this cartoon from the early 2000, late 90s, 2000, right? This exhibit, the Futurama exhibit, was shown at the 1939 World's Fair in New York, and in this exhibit, it profiled advanced technology for the time and even today of things like self-driving cars and unlimited automobile speeds. And for Futurama, this was the key to the vision of the future. And we still have those same visions today, and contemporary examples are flying cars, hyperloops. And since the advent of car-centric society, you also describe how these novelties have been used to eliminate public transit. They've been used to transform urban planning and also to distract attempts, most famously in California, distract from attempts to fight climate change through the building of new public transportation. So I want to ask you, how did these tech novelties become such a force in transforming Western capitalist societies? And why do company shareholders still buy into these, dreams, really?
Yeah, it's a huge question, and thanks so much for the very kind introduction that you gave of me. I certainly appreciate it, and it's always great to hear when people enjoy the podcast, right? There are so many reasons, right? To get back to your question, it was fascinating to me to go back and look at the history of transportation as you were describing, because one of the narratives that we often get from these tech companies is that they were trying to disrupt transportation, right? Transportation was ripe for disruption, and so their technologies were going to do it. And then I think if we look at what they've actually done to the transportation system, it doesn't look very much like disruption. It looks like adding some digital technologies or batteries or whatnot into a pre-existing transportation system, but not actually changing very much. Whereas if we go back to the early days of the automobile, right, in the early 20th century, as the automobile is emerging, that's a moment when we see some real transportation disruption, right? The automobile emerges, there's this existing norm for the street where people are walking in the street, taking bicycles, they are on the streetcars, on the omnibuses, taking horse-drawn carriages, and people are existing within these norms where there are all these different modes of transportation on the one street. People, usually kids are playing on the side streets. It's very much a public space that is open to everybody. But for it to, benefit automakers, it needs to be closed off to everyone else and to be made for the automobile. And, it's easy to look at that transformation and think that that happens because, the car is this new technology. And so naturally it's going to take over because this is what progress means, right? We invent new technologies, they take over the old ones. And, this is kind of a linear idea of progress and how it works. But when you go back and look at that history, that's not exactly what happens, right? What happens is that there's a lot of opposition within cities to the automobile because of, it's taking away this public space, but even more than that, it's killing people on the roads, which is not such an obvious thing that was happening before, certainly not in the numbers that were happening, and it was particularly affecting children and young women. And so there were movements that formed in order to push back on this, in order to say, no, this is not acceptable. But there were also really powerful commercial interests that were getting behind the automobile itself, right? The automakers, the suppliers to the automakers, the oil companies. They were buying ads in the newspapers to get the support of the major newspapers at the time. Later construction interests because they need to build the roads and the suburban communities that are associated with it. And even labor groups, right? Because there are unionized jobs involved with making automobiles. And so there are all of these different interests that get behind the automobile and that lobby the government in order to change policy, in order to put in subsidies, to invest in infrastructure, in order to facilitate that transformation and the rollout of the automobile, right? And so there's a real disruption that happens, but it's not because of a new technology. It's because commercial interests are pushing for a particular change and the government gets on board with that. And part of the reason, this is something I don't go into so much in the book, but there's also a labor piece to this as well, right? Like when you have workers who are driving the streetcars and the trains, they have a lot of control over the transportation network. But as soon as you switch over to a transportation system that's reliant on the personal automobile, sure, workers can shut down production facilities, go on strike so that you can't produce more. But once those vehicles are out on the road, people can still drive around as much as they want unless people block it off, right? And so then if you compare that, and if you compare that transformation in those early days to what we're seeing now, as I was saying, there's a lot of talk of disruption, but really a lot of these technologies or ideas from Silicon Valley are oriented around maintaining the auto-oriented transportation system. And there's not a whole lot changing there other than adding some new technologies to extract some more value for these tech companies.
And I mean, I kind of want to touch off on that because you say, like, okay, with sort of the powerful commercial interests involving labor, involving governments across the board, right now what we see is electric vehicles as sort of the technological change or transformation that's needed to decarbonize the transportation sector. And you look at Ontario, right? It's the number one source of emissions. So to decarbonize a place like Ontario, you might need to think about the electric car as the solution. Like I myself personally am all about public transit, but with the way that, suburbs in Ontario are built, and that's, what houses most of the population of the province, and these suburbs are very car centric. Do you think there's still a place for the electric car in sort of this way to immediately decarbonize, short of massive upheaval that kind of, makes people move out of suburbs and into more denser communities that are more amenable to public transit? So, I mean, I'm sort of ambivalent here whether the electric car is sort of a good thing or kind of something is sort of like a distraction from real solutions.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that like we can walk and chew gum at the same time, right? And so I'm not anti-EV. I think that the electric car has a place to play in reducing the impact of, the emissions of the transportation system, right? But we also need to recognize that it's not the silver bullet, right? One of the problems that I have is a lot of these people who are promoting the electric vehicle, we see Justin Trudeau say it a lot, is that, it's zero emissions, right? Because there's no tailpipe emissions. And that's just not accurate, right? There's still a significant environmental footprint that comes from the electric vehicle. It's just that the life cycle emissions are often lower than an internal combustion vehicle, right? And that certainly depends on where the production took place, what went into the battery, the type of energy that's using to power the vehicle. But in most cases, the electric vehicle is going to have a lower life cycle emissions than an internal combustion vehicle, the type that we use today. And so that means that yes, they are a part of that transformation because, as you say, Canada, where we are, is a very auto-oriented society. Newfoundland and Labrador, where I am, certainly, there are a lot of, the way that things are built are very auto-dependent, right? We have these electric vehicles, right? They're a really key part of this transition. And I still think that even though that there are components to it, but in our policy, we need to recognize that it's not just about electric vehicles, right? While that transition is happening with electric vehicles, the focus can't just be replacing every internal combustion vehicle with an electric vehicle, right? Part of that focus needs to be, okay, we switch some of those vehicles where it's necessary in rural areas, parts of the suburbs, over to electric vehicles. But at the same time as we're doing that, we need to make serious investments in public transit, in cycling infrastructure, in thinking how we build our communities so that the services that people rely on are close to where they live. And so you don't need to travel as far in order to reach them. And those are we can do both of those things at the same time. And I would just say the other key piece on electric vehicles is that minerals are a really important part of that. We are rightfully concerned about the supply chains of fossil fuels, the emissions that come of burning them, but also the environmental damage that happens at sites of extraction and refinement, production, all these sorts of things, right? But at the same time, the electric vehicle is heavily reliant on, mining, right? On extracting a lot from the earth in order to produce these vehicles. And we know very clearly that that has environmental impacts, that has community impacts, that has impacts on the workers who are at those sites. A lot of that mining will take place in the global south, where, you know, Canadian companies, 75% of global mining companies are headquartered in Canada, are doing some pretty terrible things that we like to ignore, because they produce profit and send that back up here to us. And so we need to be aware of those things. And that's why I don't think we can have a transition that's solely about electric vehicles, that we also need to be focused on getting people out of cars as part of that switch, right? Especially at a moment where we have the opportunity to make those choices.
And I mean, for my, like, just one observation off what you just said, it seems to me that under a capitalist mode of production, with the way that profit orientation, you know, and looking at, you know, trying to walk and talk at the same time, to try to do both things of decarbonizing and like reducing car dependency, to me it sounds like, if I was an automaker like Tesla, that it doesn't sound like a very profitable or favorable situation. And so, like, you know, we already see kind of the government of Canada and other provincial governments going forward with subsidizing electric vehicles. Do you think that these sorts of policies are still necessary, or should we, you know, really hold back and reconsider how this sort of EV subsidy kind of system works out? And does that also translate into, do we need a coordinated industrial policy? Do we need to ensure that, you know, a just transition for workers that transfer their skills from combustion engine producing plants to electric vehicle producing plants? Do those skills that need to be transferred or relearned, do we depend on businesses to do that just transition, or is it like something like we need to look at what the state can do to intervene and ensure that just transition?
Yeah, you know, there's a bunch in that question, right? I would say certainly we need a just transition, and we need the state to be very, you know, heavily involved in that, because that's the way that you ensure that it's equitable at the end of the day, right? And it's not simply focused on, you know, who can profit most from what is going on there. On electric vehicle subsidies, I would say I'm on the fence. I think it really depends on how you design the subsidy. One of the problems that we saw with early electric vehicle subsidies was that, you know, they were not targeted, and so the people who were benefiting from them were wealthy people who could afford to buy electric vehicles, right? And I think that's a problem. There's a bit of targeting in the Canadian electric vehicle subsidy, where it only counts on vehicles below a certain price threshold. Maybe we could say that threshold's still a bit too high, but I think that's a really important piece of this. And then just broadly on your question around capitalism, like, I would say part of the reason that we are such a car-dependent society is that it works really well for the capitalist mode of production, right? It's very profitable in order to build communities in a way that force everyone to buy an automobile, because then everyone needs to buy an automobile, everyone needs to buy insurance, everyone needs to get maintenance, everyone needs to fill up. You know, there are all these you know, costs that are associated with it that benefit a whole load of different companies. And that means that people need to keep working in order to make the money in order to pay for those things. Whereas if we had a society that was more oriented around cycling and public transit, people wouldn't need to spend that much money. You know, you wouldn't need to build as many buses or trains or bikes as you would need to build cars, or like maybe you'd need to build a lot of bikes, but there's not as much that goes into building a bike as building a car. It's less intensive, right? And so you can see how that doesn't exactly work out when we think about the way that the system is designed. And, you know, I would just say finally, like, you know, Unifor has a new president, and one of the first things she said was that we need an electric vehicle strategy, right? And I think that we do, but I also think that we can't just be focused on electric vehicles and making that transition, because we do need to be investing a lot in public transit and cycling and all these other things as well.
And, you know, back to that report, and then also like that Unifor report that just came out, and as well with regards to your special friend here, Elon Musk, in 2020, reacting to the coup in Bolivia, Elon Musk on Twitter, as he normally does, did a little bit of an outburst, and he tweeted, "We will coup whoever we want, deal with it." And that is obviously in relation to the likely advantageous supply chain situation a more conservative government in Bolivia would provide to increase Tesla's profitability with regards to extracting minerals for its Tesla batteries. So to me, this statement, of course, implies a desire for the enormous exploitation of land, the exploitation of indigenous people, the exploitation of workers. Had that coup succeeded, and still, despite all these comments, Time magazine still names Elon Musk Person of the Year in 2021. And so, as Twitter's #1 Muskologist, I'd like to ask, with this vision of the future of transport that relies on exploitation, why is he so regarded by the mainstream media, and what can we maybe do to ignore him better?
Yeah, it's a big problem, right? Because if we think about the existing automotive system, like it was really key to building out these kind of global supply chains. I think a lot of people forget that, right? It was a real kind of pioneer in doing that. And these are supply chains that depend on extraction from the global south to the global north in order to extract all these resources that go into creating these vehicles and allow us to get around in the way that we do. And so now we have an opportunity to think twice about that, see if that was a good thing to do, to maybe rethink those relationships and how unequal they are. And now, if we make this transition that's just to electric vehicles, the only real change there is from supply chains based on, say, fossil fuels to supply chains based on minerals, and a significant expansion in the extraction of minerals. And I don't think that really changes anything significant. If we're talking about this kind of offhand comment about we'll coup whoever we want, and that's not to say Elon Musk was in any way involved in the Bolivia coup. I don't think that's the case. But it does show that as we've seen governments launch wars in order to defend access to fossil fuels around the world, from way back in the 50s with the Iran overthrowing of Mossadegh, all the way up to the Iraq war in 2003. This is a really long history of doing this, and I think that we could see similar interventions in countries in order to ensure access to mineral supplies. And there's already efforts by Canada, by the United States, in order to secure mineral supply chains, because they know how key some of these minerals are going to be for this, supposed clean transition, or whatever they want to call it. If we're thinking about Musk, obviously he's pushing this idea of what the future of transportation should be, and is very opposed to efforts to expand high-speed rail or public transit or things like this, and frequently proposes really stupid ideas for transportation in order to stifle efforts to realize those things, right? The Hyperloop was a way to challenge California's high-speed rail system. The Boring Company and autonomous vehicles are quite, directly targeted at public transit and saying we don't need public transit, we have these things instead, they'll solve traffic, we can just keep everyone in cars, right? And so, part of the reason that Elon Musk and that people are so obsessed with Elon Musk, especially, or at least were, was that he was really the guy who emerged and said, we can use technology to solve all these problems. We can have a better future at a moment when I think there was a lot less hope about what a future could look like. And we were certainly deep in a neoliberal period where the governments were not offering hopeful visions for the future. We're not able to deliver on those, certainly. And so a man like Elon Musk comes along and is very attractive in saying, look, we're going to go to Mars. We're going to realize our science fiction dreams. We're going to solve climate change, all these sorts of things. And I think now we are in the middle, as we were saying, of a reassessment of Elon Musk. And I think that's really healthy. It's overdue. And, hopefully that allows us to think beyond the futures that Elon Musk has tried to push on us.
And I think last question here, going back to all of the promises of those futures. So you have your hyperloops, you have your flying cars, you have your carbon capture technologies that are somehow already modeled into emissions reduction scenarios, but these technologies haven't really made it past the research and development phase of things. They're not going to be ready in 5 years, but we're already saying that they're going to be ready in 5 years. In fact, we've been saying this 10 years ago that they're going to be ready in 5 years. Certainly technology and innovation, quote unquote, is needed to fight the climate crisis, to ensure that, we have, not an emergency situation where floods and fires happen on a regular basis. What does your future for technology and innovation look like?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And, when we think about technologies, if we think about climate change, for example, we really do already have the technologies that we need in order to address this, right? And the constant talk about things like carbon capture or other technologies is really, in my view, a way to distract from taking the action that we should be taking right now by offering, a techno fantasy for the future. We don't need to make these serious changes now to reduce emissions, because in the future a technology will come along that will save us from the problem that we've created for ourselves, right? The kind of promise of carbon capture is that we massively increase emissions now, but later in the century, we'll be able to take it out of the air. And that is very much unproven. And, all of the targets that have been set for carbon capture have been missed over the years, time and time again. And so that's really, worrying, right? And so if we think about what a better future for technology would be, I think you'd want technology that's more oriented around the goals of the public, right? And actually serving public goals, and having the state more involved in ensuring that funding is directed in that way. One thing that we forget is that the government is actually heavily involved in determining the kinds of quote unquote innovation that happens, because we forget that the history of the tech industry in the United States, for example, but also in Canada, is largely determined by where public funding is directed. Silicon Valley wouldn't exist today if it wasn't for all the money that the US government and the military funneled into the Bay Area from World War II right through to today. And that gets written out of the histories that we hear of Silicon Valley, because it doesn't fit into the narrative that they like to tell themselves. And so, I think that the government needs to be more involved in ensuring and funding the technologies that are actually going to serve the public good, but also involved to regulate and kind of counter the technologies that don't serve our best interests. And I think that's one place where the government has really let us down, especially over the past decade or so. We could go back to privatization of the internet, all these other problems that were done that shouldn't have happened. But we really kind of fell for the idea that the tech companies were selling us, that we just needed to let them innovate and, put their technologies out into the world and launch their business models, and this was going to make everything better. And now we see Uber eroding labor regulations. We see Facebook and all of like the terrible stuff that has come of that platform. We see the false promises of self-driving cars. We see how many of the in-car display systems are actually making people more distracted when they drive rather than less so, as the promise was. So time and time again, we get these promises, and that's not actually how it works out in practice.
No, thank you for that insight. And I mean, short of seeing more viral videos of Teslas revving into silhouettes of children, I want everybody on watching today to check out Road to Nowhere: What Silicon Valley Gets Wrong About the Future of Transportation. A very good book. Check it out, Verso Books. You can order that online and not through other tech evil giants like Amazon. Very much available elsewhere. But again, Paris Marx, thank you for joining the Broadband Institute on this conversation. You can learn more about the Broadband Institute at broadbandinstitute.ca. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and hopefully as well, we see some sort of transformation as we look at real climate action, a real just transition that moves away from billionaires like your favorite Elon Musk towards something that looks after something like the public good.
Absolutely. No, thanks so much for having me. It was great to chat with you. Great to have this hosted by the Broadband Institute. Thanks so much.
All right. Take care, everyone. Bye for now.